Peace and love, family. It's your boy, BrothaTruth, and I want to thank you all for tuning in for the first recording special of Do You Know the Truth, Volume 1. It's going to be extraordinary. So before I get started, man, I like to say that my style of teaching is very different. I don't like to just go into giving people the remedy and telling people different techniques and strategies that they can use to get the outcomes that they probably want to get commercially. But I really focus on really teaching our people the history of where we come from so that we can focus on where we need to go here in the future. So I only think that it's right that we take it back to a time where maritime and commerce first started before we get into the modern day times of commerce as we know it today. So first and foremost, I want to start with the master mariners. And these people are called the Phoenicians, all right? The seeds of this modern day matrix started with the Phoenicians, also known as the master mariners. The names Phoenicians used to describe these people in the first millennium BC was an invention from the word phoenix. It was a Greek word. And I know you all have heard many movies and seen and things like X-Men, they'll always say rise of the phoenix, right? And really this is just about us rising as a people, the old phoenix, the ancient civilization as who we were, coming back into the knowledge of our ancient selves. Okay, so when you see the rise of the phoenix, that's what that metaphor and allegory is representing. Their civilization implemented one of the first written languages to mankind as we know today. All right, this is very important because the Phoenicians were the ones who documented their first languages for trading. They used to have different things that they used to trade and sell from different communities. They had things called Lebanon and Murex shells that they actually used to trade, just like how you see here on my neck now, just different shells that the wives used to actually make for the husbands. And these were things that they could barter and trade that used to represent different meanings within the community. For example, if I had a shell and necklaces here, and let's say I had 100 shells on this necklace and it represented 100 acres of land, all right? If I wanted to barter and trade, I could take one of these shells off and actually give them to another man to barter and trade, and that would represent that shell or that acre or piece of land over there, okay? So this is just important because we must realize that we used to operate in a time that was outside of these US dollars and these financial monies that we know today, all right? We used to be able to barter and trade without needing these monetary things that we know. Okay, so that's very important. In the 8th century BC, the Greeks adopted the laws and the alphabet of the Phoenicians, and eventually they ended up taking them over and conquering them through an invasion. Now, it's important that we also know too that the original Greeks were also melanated people, okay? It wasn't what we think today as the imagery that we see with the Hercules and things. These actual Greeks, the first ones that we even know with the 300 during those times, were actually melanated people. But a lot of them actually took on a lot of the culture and the traditions and the writings of the Phoenicians, okay? And they actually brought that into their society, and eventually there was a man by the name of King Alexander the Great. Now, King Alexander was extraordinary in time because he was one of the first kings who really brought war into the world. And not only did he bring war, but he also conquered the Phoenicians and adopted their whole writing system, their whole language and their culture. And he brought in something called the Hellenistic period, and also iconoclasm. Iconoclasm is basically when you come in and totally destroy the imagery of the indigenous people that were already there before you and actually whitewash the imagery, shall we say. And this is when he kind of came through and changed the astrological system and the language system. And, you know, this is when he replaced a lot of our gods with their own gods like Hercules and things of that nature. All right. So this important time period in history was called the Hellenistic period. OK, and I would like to think that he brought hell And that's exactly what he did. Not only that, the Greeks sent out decrees to the other nations that everyone should leave from their customs of their family homes and their fathers, and should now all be one to be joined under this Greek nation. Phoenicians were disconnected from their knowledge, and since then we have been lost as a nation of people globally, because we've been disconnected from our Phoenician knowledge and our ancestry history of who we were and knowledge of self. We must not ever forget that the Phoenicians traveled all across the world and traded and did business everywhere with all the indigenous people, and made families and traded bloodlines and all of this. And we too, even in America, have the Phoenician blood that runs through us. So it's important to know that we've been put under this Greek and Roman system of servitude, and we have to find our way out. We have to find our way back to knowledge of self. Because after the Greeks had their power and reign for time, eventually they were taken over by the Romans. And this is when a whole new era came in and changed everything to what we even know today. So before we even go on, I want to talk about the importance of Rome, because Rome eventually ended up taking over the Greek Empire, and they still have the power of what we know today operating under the Roman Empire. All right. Now we're going to key in on a certain particular part dealing with the British Isles in the Roman Empire, because that has a lot to do with what's going on today in our modern times. All right. So first and foremost, the written history of the British Isles begins essentially with the Romans conquering most of the British Isles by 100 CE. By the early 5th century, the Roman Empire could no longer fight off the external threats by the Germanic tribes that were expanding into Western Europe. All right. So basically they had to call home all of their soldiers from the British Isles and say, yo, we need y'all back home in the Roman Empire. Yo, they're flooding us out here. These indigenous brothers and sisters, these Germans, they're killing us. We need more backup. So they ended up having to abandon their land that the Roman Empire took over in the British Isles and come back home, right, to Europe. That's when you had some of these Germanic tribes that saw the chance to go over here and start a new home, start a new life for their indigenous families. And that's exactly what they did. You now have these Germanic tribes, which were really Anglos, Saxons, and Jutes, who all left Germany and went over here to the British Isles. And they ended up starting families, starting homes, and ended up taking over new territories, and they conquered new lands. And eventually these Angles and these Saxons would all come together, and they would create a new land and a new nation that would be called Angleland, AKA England. And we must realize that this nation of people was a very mixed nation of indigenous and Caucasian people. All right. And they were called the Anglo-Saxons. But the Anglos, the Saxons, and the Picts took over different territories of the British Isles in 410 AD. They became known as the Anglo-Saxons. Viking invasions of the 800s led to the Anglo-Saxons all to come together and unite under King Alfred and be called England, AKA Angleland. All right. Now, they created their own society that operated under Anglo-Saxon law. All right. It was highly influenced by Germanic law, which was extremely different than the Roman law and the system that was going on in the rest of the Roman Empire in Europe at the time. Their laws were laid down not by a central authority, but by an actual tribe, by a nation of people. And they did things the indigenous way. They were Anglo-Saxons, the true Anglo-Saxons. All right. And in the late 6th century, Pope Gregory and the Catholic Church dispensed Augustine and monks to Britain to go over there to convert the Anglo-Saxons into Christianity, because eventually they thought that they were savages. And we know how that goes in history. When they thought they were savages, they actually sent somebody over there with a religion to go and civilize them. And that's exactly what happened to a lot of these Anglo-Saxon brothers and sisters. Now, before moving forward and even talking about more into the history of our English heritage and our law, I want to also key in just on colors and definitions. I want to also talk about our heritage and identity, right? Because a lot of us just think that we get these English and these European names, Scottish and these Irish names from slavery, which I can promise you is completely false, right? Because a lot of us, more than 90% of us, got our English heritage from culture, trading, from actually heritage from many of them that did business with us here when they stayed after the French and Indian War. But let me explain. First and foremost, let's talk about definitions of color. We have swarthy. right? And I'm sure many of you all have heard of that term. Swarthy means of a dark color, complexion, or cast. Before moving on too, I want to actually key in on just some Irish, Scottish, and English names, yo. Because we know names like Arthur. We've heard names like that our whole life. But names like Arthur means very black, right? It just doesn't mean a little, not just a tad, but it means very black. So names like Arthur, names like Sierra, Brianna, Carrie, Blake, these are all names that mean dark, that mean black, that stem from Irish, English, and Scottish heritage, but actually stem from melanation. This is very important that we know this moving forward, because a lot of you all have English and Irish and Scottish last names. They actually come from melanated family houses, y'all, and y'all need to understand this. So, moving along, I wanted to show you all the roles list of some of the soldiers that were actually here in Virginia. Now, before there was the United States of America, they had Virginia, right? And Virginia was actually here, and it was named after the Virgin Queen over there in England, Mary. This land was named Virginia, and it was a new settlement that they tried to start under her name, but eventually it all failed, and King James came along, and he ended up starting his own version, and he kept, Virginia alive. Started Jamestown, which is the same person who created that King James version of your Bible and everything. But you have Virginia that was here, and it was set up before the United States. And basically you had King James, who had sent Englishmen over here to set up new lands and set up new territories with these new colonies in his new Jamestown that he was putting in place. But when he got here, there was Indians, and he had to fight off the Frenchmen too as well. So with that being said, he was like, well, you know what? I need to hire some more Englishmen, some more Europeans, some more Scottish, some more Irishmen to come in here and import to the Americas so that can help us fight off these Indians and fight off some of these Frenchmen. So we're going to actually look at the roles list of some of these soldiers who were imported from Europe and what they looked like and what they appeared to be when they were imported here, okay? And as you actually see, many of these soldiers, even the captain, right, was ruddy. He was dark. They have brown, dark complexion. If you look on here, and I mean, as you see, most of these brothers, if you look at the very Lieutenant Colonel Stevens, right, he was from Scotland, and he was ruddy complexion. That's also melanated, right? And then you also have the sergeant, who was dark complexion, right? He was from England, right? And then you also have other sergeants, right? And other soldiers who were ruddy, brown, dark. And they were all from Scotland, England, Scotland, England, Ireland. What I'm saying is many of these soldiers who got imported into the Americas before the United States of America was even set up to fight the French and Indian War, these were melanated people, 80% of these soldiers, okay? All right? And what do you think happened after the wars and things were over with? Do you think they just all hopped on a boat and went back home to Europe? Absolutely not. Many of them stayed here, started families, started foundations, started plantations, and actually started businesses, y'all. And many of them, I mean, what do you think happened when they saw some of these beautiful sisters running around here in feathers, right? They made families, okay? All right? So this is very important. This is how many of you all got pulled in to the English culture and the heritage and got pulled into these English names that you know of today. All right? So stop thinking that many of us got these English names and heritage from slavery when many of you all go back to times and heritage that have never been slaves before. You people have connections and family going all the way back to Europe, and heritage and territory and land and claims that you can make even in Europe no different than you can here in America. Which leads me to my next point with books like Black Slave Owners, right? That shows free black slave masters in South Carolina who had slaves. Now, what we must understand too, that this is not the kind of slavery that we know and that we see of today. Men having plantations, which were something like corporations today, and they were just businesses. All right, many of them took care of the women and the men or whatever. It wasn't as much of the brutal type of slavery as we know of today that we see in movies and things. Again, it was indentured servitude. Not saying that it was right or wrong, but at the end of the day, many of these brothers and sisters were melanated people who were slave owners. And it wasn't just the Caucasians as we might think. So history has quite a uniqueness to it once you actually go back and actually research some of this information. And all this is documented in books like Black Slave Owners. As much as I love to say I love my American heritage and my tribal heritage here, I want you all to also know, for the purpose of commerce, right? And for the purpose of the system that we are operating in today, you speak English, you think English, you write English, you have English surnames. Now it's important that you learn the English laws that apply to your English ass, all right? Okay? Because there's no way that we're up here speaking, thinking, and having a whole visual communication with each other right now in English, and we don't know the laws that protect us as English people. Let's dig into it. Now, we've all seen movies like The Matrix and John Wick 4, but there's important characters that they always put in there to kind of show you subliminally who has the power. And I can tell you that because they always show you this one character, and his name is the Frenchman. And as you know, Neo couldn't get through the train station unless they actually got the permission of the Frenchman. And as you also know too, in John Wick 4, that was the main character, that was the one that was against John Wick in the entire movie. It was the Frenchman who was trying to take John Wick out and kill him, because you couldn't do anything in the entire system unless it went through the Frenchman. So in reality, when it comes to history, the Frenchman is a reference to William the Conqueror. William was the Duke of Normandy of France who aspired to take over the English throne, right? And William the Conqueror defeated the Anglo-Saxons during the Norman conquest in 1066. So now you actually have a French king who's literally conquered the Anglo-Saxon people and took over the English throne, and now he sits on it, right? You have a Frenchman sitting on the English throne, all right? So this is very important. Now, once he got there on the throne, he didn't want to just disregard all of the English people and their barons. He wanted to still do business and make sure that he could actually run this nation and keep everybody happy. So he said, you know what? I'm gonna make my French high class happy, and I'm gonna make the English high class happy. So you know what? We're gonna take some of your Anglo-Saxon laws, and we're gonna take some of your French Norman laws, and we're gonna create this whole new system of laws just for this country that we took over called England. And we're gonna call it English Common Law, all right? This is very important, because common laws are just laws that we share in common as we the people. That's all it is, y'all. Laws we share in common as we the people. And these were laws that were put in place to compensate the people who were suffered for wrongful acts. Not only did King William set up English common law, he also set up the first English tax system that was put in place to actually tax the citizens of the English nation, all right? So this is very important, because taxation, as we know of it today, started at the root of William the Conqueror and the Frenchmen taking over the English throne. The foundations of common law. Now, one thing that we must understand, because a lot of us go into these courtrooms and we try to assert our sovereignty, and we get mad when we don't get the remedies that we want to get. It's because we're not in the proper courtrooms or in the proper venues. The venue or the courtroom that you're in is very important, because there is a difference between high courts and low courts, okay? And depending on the kind of remedy that you are seeking or receiving, certain courts and certain judges are only authorized to give you certain remedies, okay? This is very important. So if you go into these lower level courts that are operating under military laws, that are operating under codes and statutes of the bar, then they're not really authorized to operate under English common law. You see? Because William the Conqueror put something called the Curia Regis in place, and this was like a high court system, okay? He put a high court system in place, and it had traveling judges that would travel all across England, basically to these Anglo-Saxon communities, and say, hey, well, we got our own form of government. We got our own court system here, and you all can petition to the King's Court, and this is gonna supersede these lower levels and whatever codes or statutes or whatever they got going on here, and you can petition to the high courts, and we're gonna give you a remedy according to English common law, okay? So this is where the roots of high courts and low courts came from, because you had William the Conqueror who put these traveling judges in place to go to these different cities and host high court in this area, in these lands and territories. Okay? Because again, if you want to get constitutional remedies, you want to get equitable remedies, you want to get these remedies that actually protect your rights, then you want to go to the high courts. If you're going to the low courts, those are for the shadows, for the slaves, for the US citizens. We want to operate in a different venue and jurisdiction. And back then, when many of these judgments of these court cases used to pass, we used to use these court cases as something called precedents, all right? And still today we use these. But in law, when we don't know how we're going to rule on a certain situation, we'll always look back to what previous judges did. And that's called a precedent. Judicial precedent is the source of law where past decisions of the judges create law for future judges to follow. This is very important because when you all are dealing with your court cases, you should always go back and go and look for precedents that deal with matters dealing with yours. Because if they ruled in the favor of what you're trying to get, you should pull that court case and put it on the record as a precedent saying, yo, this is how a judge ruled in the past, and I expect you all to do the exact same thing. Precedents are important, and make sure that you utilize them in your courtroom processes. Now, it's important to know that there's a difference between low courts and these high courts today, especially when we're dealing with the system, when we want to get our remedies. So eventually over time, English common law developed and evolved, and they ended up implementing something called writs. And writs were a command of the king instructing the addressee to call the defendant into his court and to resolve this dispute in the presence of the parties. A writ is an order in writing issued in the name of a sovereign or of a court or judicial officer commanding the person to perform or refrain from performing an act specified therein. So there were many different types of writs, but the ones that we want to focus on are called prerogative writs, and they have many different usages. So let's start first with the habeas corpus. The habeas corpus was to direct the release of a person that was detained unlawfully. Let's say somebody went to jail over a traffic violation, over a code or a statute, something that was unlawful according to the Constitution. Then somebody could write an actual writ of habeas corpus, and they can challenge that under the Constitution and under English common law to see, yo, was this person locked up lawfully? Or was he being railroaded over some codes or statutes that has nothing to do with the Constitution? All right, so this is very important. And then you have the writ of mandamus, right? And a writ of mandamus is to direct the public authority to do its duty. Sometime when you guys get to putting in some of this information and paperwork for your court cases, you'll see they'll get quiet or they'll just stand still. And a lot of times they don't want to do their duty and their job of what they're supposed to do. That's when we can actually send a writ of mandamus to the actual attorney general, and he can actually come down and make them do what they're supposed to do. Boom. And then we have a writ of quo warranto. This is one of my favorite because this directs a person to vacate an office that had assumed it wrongfully. Basically, it's saying if you're a person who's saying that you're a judge, then and you took an oath of office, then you should be upholding the Constitution, correct? If that's the case, then why are you trying to railroad me with codes and statutes with things that aren't even a part of the Constitution that you swore to uphold? What does it even say the word drive in the Constitution, first of all? But where does it say that I can't travel at 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 miles per hour? When the Constitution was originally first created, did they even have speed limits? Wasn't it just horses and a carriage back then? So at the end of the day, we must understand that they're operating under a totally different system, and they're trying to persecute us as Americans when they're operating under British laws. Right? There's no way that you could persecute an American man under British laws because the bar represents the British accredited registry, but yet you're trying to persecute Americans. How? You swore to uphold this US Constitution, but yet you're persecuting me under British laws. How does that work? Doesn't that sound like treason? And what is the consequence for treason, family? It's death. Right? So this is very important to know that when we actually stand on our laws and actually assert them against them and actually alert them and put them on notice about what they are doing, watch how quick they start backpedaling faster than Mike Jackson could do the moonwalk. Watch it, okay? So this is very important, and these are just some key writs that you all need to know and understand. Which brings me to the Constitution, which we've already talked about, and the Magna Carta. Right? And King John. Because we've all seen Robin Hood and movies like that growing up, but we never really understood the depths of what they were really trying to show us. Now, in those movies, they never ever actually had King John be sat down to sign the Magna Carta, but there was a very important role that we all need to understand that King John of Locksley played, okay? Robin Hood just wasn't out here wanting to steal from King John just because he didn't like him. It was because King John was a king who was ruling as a Frenchman now over this English throne, who was taxing the people, sending Englishmen off to wars and getting many of us killed now. So after all of the taxation and all the crime and all the killings of all the innocent Englishmen, the barons got together and we said, well, you know what, King John? We're gonna make you sign this agreement. And if you don't, we're gonna kill you. We want you to respect our rights as the Englishmen. If not, we're gonna have to rope you up and tie you up and throw you in the river somewhere. And that's when King John said, well, hey, you know what? Let's do it. I don't want no war, I don't want no beef, so let's go ahead and sign this document. And it was called the Magna Carta. Yeah, those same Jay-Z Magna Carta albums that we didn't know or understand had an actual connection to us. So basically, the Magna Carta was drafted by the English barons as a constitutional contract with King John and the monarchy to protect the rights of the subjects, okay? And if any king or queen breached the Magna Carta, they would be sentenced to death by the people for treason, just like Charles I. Let's talk about it. King Charles I believed that the heads of the church and the heads of the monarchy should be treated with difference. He dissolved parliament when faced with opposition and effectively ruled alone on many, many years and occasions. He would only reassemble parliament to raise funds and to tax the citizens, y'all. That was it. And when he ran out of money of expensive foreign wars, he would start taxing them again and taxing him again. So eventually, Parliament voted to have him overthrown and they executed him for going against the Magna Carta, which was taxing the people without their authorization or their permission. All right? They eventually led to the Bill of Rights being passed in 1688 that specifically laid out the depths and the protection of all Englishmen and monarchs and agents that they had to respect. All right? And every state constitution as we know of it today actually stems from the English Bill of Rights and the Magna Carta, right? So the English Bill of Rights actually broke down the specifics, the right to bear arms, the right to travel, all of these God-given rights that were given to us as free men, our natural rights that were protected by God, okay? That's what the Constitution was put in place for, y'all. And this is something that no monarch or no police or anybody can infringe upon. If the king can have his head cut off for going against his oath, why can't the police officer have his head cut off for going against his oath as well? Right? So it's the exact same thing, and this is important that we know this because we must learn how to stand on law and learn how to assert it. If not, we are defenseless. We are dead here. All right?
When our people need direction, we give their status a correction. It's never about what you do, but how you do it.